Hello, everyone. Today I'll be talking about rubles, Chervonsky, and foreign currency in Bulgakov's Master and Margarita. And firstly, just for a little background on Master and Margarita, this is probably a review for a lot of you. It was written by Bulgakov, who was born in 1891, and he served in the White Army in the Russian Civil War, and then ultimately lived under both Lenin and Stalin. And so he really understands and lived through the time that he writes about. Following the Russian Civil War, there were disastrous economic conditions and extreme inflation. And so to try to combat these conditions, Lenin proposed the new economic policy in 1921. And this was ultimately abandoned by Stalin in 1928. But a crucial component of the new economic policy was the issuance of this new currency, the Chervonets notes. And these began to be issued in 1922, and they were issued by the state bank as banknotes. And the goal of them was to be partially backed by gold or other precious metals. And just 1 year after they were issued, they took up the vast majority of the monetary supply. However, there was still some faith in the ruble that kind of persisted for many years. And the ruble was ultimately reinstated in 1947 in some of the post-World War II reforms. And obviously, it's the currency today. And here's a picture of one of the banknotes for Lenin there. But the goal of my paper was partially to look at how the English translations that a lot of us read for classes can sometimes take away from the criticisms that Bulgakov is making about the Stalin regime. And so here I have two examples of what would be a correct translation. Firstly, in the context of Master and Margarita, in the first example, when someone is trying to flee the black magic show at the theater, he gets in the taxi. And when we read the story, it seems to imply that the taxi driver would not accept like a 10 ruble bill, but he would accept the 2-3 ruble bills. But actually, the taxi driver wouldn't accept this new Chervonets banknote, but he would accept the old ruble. And later on, you can see another example where the author is talking about the Chervonets banknotes, which turned into a bottle, like a label for a water bottle. And so ultimately, this is really important for the criticism that Bulgakov is making, because only these new Chervonets banknotes that were issued by Lenin turn into worthless objects in the story. And only these new currency kind of cause this problem, while the old ruble, which can kind of be representative of like old Russian traditions, never turn into worthless objects. Additionally, it's important to note kind of the parallel that the devil figure in the story, Walnut, is the one who introduces a lot of this money into the plot line, whether it's at like the Magic Theater or whether he's bribing someone. And this really parallels to Lenin being the one who is introducing this new currency into this Russian society. And finally, the kind of role of this new banknote is just to illustrate that the people of Moscow still have this greed and desire for material wealth, despite the idea of like a new Soviet selfless man. Additionally, I focused on the role of foreign currency in Master and Margarita. So following the issuance of this new currency, to try to hasten its acceptance in society, they began limiting possessing foreign currency. And so they would also have the secret police during 2 different time periods do raids on people to try to take any foreign currency or gold or jewels that they might have. And it was important for the government to get this foreign currency because they needed it to import new products to achieve their 5-year plan. And so they would also establish these foreign currency stores with like luxurious items that if you had rightfully obtained or you were a member and like you were in high standing, then you could go into these stores and have access to products that most people did not have. And it's important to note because Bulgakov, because he was an author, got some of his kind of salary in foreign currency, and he was able to go into these stores. And in Master and Margarita, we see this theme of foreign currency a lot. Firstly, we have Nicanor, who was the chairman of the House Committee, where one of the main characters who dies lived. And so Nicanor, when he was interacting with Wolin's crew of devils, he ultimately was bribed, essentially. And he was arrested for this immediately after the devils called the secret police and told them that he had this foreign currency. And essentially, the process of Nicanor's arrest was a very typical example of the way that the secret police would immediately arrest anyone and kind of just presume that they're guilty and just be very brutal. And while he is in police custody, he ultimately goes to a mental hospital. And he has this dream of a show trial in a theater where the MC's main job is to get everyone in the audience to give up their foreign currency and precious items. And everyone is obviously assumed to be guilty. And the fact that it's in a theater kind of makes this critique of the way that the secret police would conduct these raids and campaigns, that it was quite literally a show trial. There was a lot of injustice in the way that they were doing these campaigns. And one more interesting thing to note about the dream is that everyone in the audience has long beards, which is kind of maybe a symbolism of the old believers who kind of represent Russian tradition and the way that Lenin and the secret police are attacking this Russian tradition. And then finally, we see foreign currency in the fire that 2 of the devils set at one of the foreign currency stores. And so the 2 devils go into the store and they marvel at the luxurious items that are there compared to what the average store looks like. And they make a comment about a foreigner who's there in a fancy suit stuffed to the gills with foreign currency. But then they say, what about our fellow citizen, our compatriot? This makes me bitter. And it's just this very obvious critique of the injustice that these foreign currency stores created in the Russian society. And so the 2 devils ultimately set fire to the store. And it really just kind of shows that there was this massive injustice despite the government trying to portray everyone as equal and selfless. And there was a strong desire for these luxury items that were only available to a certain few people. Ultimately, the role of money is arguably Bulgakov's most important literary device and kind of his expose of the Soviet experiment. The author uses Walnut, who uses black magic to kind of expose the true values of Moscow's citizens. And he says he comes to Moscow, this devil figure comes to Moscow to see if the people of Moscow have changed in any significant way. And he determines that they have changed on the outside, but when he's poised with this question of have they changed on the inside, he concludes that the answer is no. He says that they are like people anywhere. They love money, but that has always been true. People love money. And, on the whole, they remind me of their predecessors. Only the housing shortage has had a bad effect on them. which is kind of a funny line. But ultimately, Woland is this kind of eternal figure because he has the power to have knowledge of what was happening in Jerusalem around Jesus's crucifixion. He can easily compare people across different time periods and different locations. And so it's an interesting perspective and way to kind of critique the fact that despite the government's best efforts to kind of portray this selfless figure, people are still greedy. However, what I do like about this story, while it is kind of saying that people are greedy and they always kind of will be, it's not necessarily a negative commentary on humanity. Rather, it's more a commentary on how kind of dangerous it can be to blindly follow good while ignoring this kind of complex relationship between good and evil. And so he has this famous quote, "What would your good do if evil didn't exist? And what would the earth look like if all the shadows of evil disappeared? After all, shadows are cast by things and people." And I think this really sums up the message of the story, that we come to almost sympathize or like laugh at this devilish figure, and we come to sometimes symbolize with Pontius Pilate at times, who typically in Christianity he's painted as just this bad person. And so you just kind of like learn more about the coexistence between good and evil. And this relates to his critique on the Stalin regime because of this the Soviet Union's ideology of just blindly following good and following the goals of communism and unity while ignoring the elements of human nature like greed that are still going to exist in society. So that is kind of my presentation there.
Catherine is our next presenter. Oh. Thank you, Melanie.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here today. I'm going to be presenting on Lyudmila Ulitskaya's Sonetchka today. And what the title of my paper is Significance and Impact of the Russian Novel in Lyudmila Ulitskaya's Sonetchka. Okay, so I'm just putting this up. I haven't gotten to it yet, but I'm just putting it up. Okay. Lyudmila Ulitskaya's 1995 povest Sonetchka is the story of the life of a Belarusian Jewish woman living in Russia over the course of the Soviet century. At first, Sonetchka appears to be a simple girl, aggressively ordinary, who is content to pass her time between the pages of her favorite book and amidst the dusty shelves and volumes of the library where she works. But despite her simple appearance and homely pleasures, Sonetchka is anything but ordinary. And in reality, she's that rare form of human being who consistently sacrifices her own aspirations, personal comforts, and basic human needs for the ones of those she loves. This facet of her character is highlighted firstly in her marriage to her husband, Robert, for whom she gives up her passion for reading altogether, to raise and care for their family, and in her role as a mother to her daughter, Tanya, for whom she tirelessly works to shield from the harshness of their Soviet reality. Despite everything she does for her husband and their daughter, Tanya, the love and empathy she shows for them both each and every day goes largely unnoticed and even at times abused. So where does Sonetchka get the capacity to love her family despite the thanklessness and abuse she receives in return? This paper explores how Russian literature is the answer to this question and how it shapes Sonetchka, given the prominence of her love for reading, and it shapes her into the empathetic and unflinchingly self-sacrificial woman, wife, and mother that she is. I posit that without the characters and events in the core works of Russian literature that she spends so much time reading and studying, she wouldn't have been able to develop her ability to love and empathize with the people in her immediate vicinity so deeply. Because the nature of fiction is such that it forces the reader to step into the life and time of another person, it can be a tremendous tool for fashioning its reader into an individual better equipped to comprehend and empathize with the full gamut of human emotion. My analysis of Sonitchka's identity as a reader, in conjunction with her identity as a Jewish woman of the Soviet Union, is rooted in Yuri Slowskin's analysis of her particular generation in his book, The Jewish Century. Slowskin's work helps to contextualize Sonitchka and her identity as a reader within her time frame by situating her within a generation of Jews in Eastern Europe who are gradually moving away from the traditional aspects of Jewish culture and religion and assimilating into the Russian and Gentile culture around them. The ultimate goal of this paper is to provide an explanation grounded in Slowskin's analysis of Sonitchka's generation as to why Sonitchka is able and willing to sacrifice her professional aspirations and tirelessly give of her own body and spirit for those she loves. So, Yuri Slowskin's book, The Jewish Century, introduces and analyzes a cultural, religious, and linguistic shift for the Jews of the Russian Empire happening at the end of the 19th century and moving forward into the 20th. Slowskin refers to the members of this generation as the congregants of the Pushkin faith or religion. Congregants of Slowskin's Pushkin faith are Jews who, for the first time, are being educated outside of an exclusively Jewish academic setting and amongst their Gentile neighbors, and as a result are embracing the language, literature, and culture of their Gentile neighbors. So for the first time, Jews are speaking, reading, and writing Russian better than they can work with languages like Hebrew and Yiddish. Languages that are traditionally considered to be their own. And as Slowskin explains, quote, the main subjects of this new Jewish education were the Russian language, Russian classical literature, and a variety of socialist texts, mostly Russian, but also translations from English and German. Better Russian led to more and more reading. As they adopted the Russian language, they began to adopt the canon of Russian literature, hearkening a wave of modernization in this generation of Jews driven by the characters, events, and themes found in Russian literature. In this way, this new generation of Jews developed a close and personal connection to Russian literature, with Pushkin at the head of the pantheon, hence the Pushkin religion. The decision of the Jewish community in the Russian Empire to integrate their children into the Gentile cultures around them was largely an effort to diminish the persecution they faced from their non-Jewish neighbors. The overarching result of these efforts to adopt the Russian language and to make Russian literature their own might be termed Jewish excellence, because despite their nomadic and alien identity in the Russian Empire, Jews actually outstripped ethnic Russians in their mastery of Russian language and culture, leading to successes in the economic, professional, and societal spheres. Slowskin writes, pogroms, quotas, and deportations notwithstanding, the Russian Jews were generally as keen on and as successful at becoming urban and modern as their German, Hungarian, British, or American counterparts, which is to say, much keener and much more successful at being capitalists, professionals, myth keepers, and revolutionary intellectuals than most people. However, this success did not come without a cost to their future as a people. By embracing the Pushkin religion, this new generation gradually left the Jewish religion behind for Russian culture, taking with them only select elements of traditional Jewish culture. Slowskin explains that converting to the Pushkin faith meant leaving the parental home. If the Russian world stood for speech, knowledge, freedom, and light, then the Jewish world represented silence, ignorance, bondage, and darkness. This shift also created a linguistic, religious, and cultural gap between this new generation of Jews and the generations that came before them. Jews embracing the Pushkin religion now spoke better Russian and worse Hebrew or Yiddish than their parents and grandparents, and they became more culturally fluent in the mainstream Russian sphere and than they were familiar with Jewish religious texts and customs. So looking at Sonitchka through the lens of Slowskin's Pushkin faith allows us to understand why Sonitchka's identity as a reader has played the key role in shaping her character. Sonitchka is descended from a father who was born and raised by Jews and who lived and practiced the traditional facets of Jewish custom. And Sonitchka's father is a descendant of a blacksmith in a little Jewish shtetl in Belarusia, was a born engineer with a strong practical sense. As for her mother, until her death, she wore a silly little wig under a clean polka dot scarf, secretly working away at her Singer sewing machine. But we don't see these traditions and customs playing out in Sonichka's life. Sonichka grew up outside the shtetl, doesn't wear the traditional Orthodox Jewish garb for women that her mother did, and her identity as a Jew is secondary to her identity as a reader. The first line of the story indicates her love for reading, and the first third of the story is focused on her life dedicated to Russian literature. Sonichka is part of Sloskin's Pushkin faith. She is removed from the traditional aspects of Jewish culture, living and being educated amongst Gentile peers, and most importantly, she has developed a close and personal connection to Russian literature that in turn shapes her. Sonichka practically spends the first 27 years of her life reading before meeting her husband, Robert. Yes, her childhood is spent reading books, but once she reaches adulthood, she works as a librarian. And even though she never finishes due to the start of World War II, she does pursue a degree in Russian literature and language. Wholly pure and intrinsically motivated, Sonichka's love for reading springs from within herself and not from any external encouragement or demand. Her affinity for the printed word was so great that fictional characters became as close living people, and Natasha Rostova's luminous sufferings at the bedside of the dying Prince Andrei were equal in authenticity to the burning grief of her sister, who lost her 4-year-old daughter to a careless accident. The contents and characters of the books Sonichka reads in her early life shape her worldview and teach her how to empathize with this full gamut of human emotion. Characters like Lev Tolstoy's Natasha Rostova and her experience caring for Prince Andrei Balkansky and grieving for him after he dies a premature death serves Sonichka in helping her comprehend her sister's experience losing her child, who has perished in an accident also before reaching her prime. What eventually supersedes Sonichka's passion for reading is meeting her husband Robert and giving birth to their only daughter Tanya. Sonichka therefore adopts an attitude that places the needs and interests of her family above her own desires and passions. Each and every day, no matter the circumstance and no matter the cost, Sonichka is there to support her family emotionally and monetarily, and at times even with her own body, as the reader encounters in the scene where Sonichka is satiating the individual appetites of both her husband and daughter when she's breastfeeding her daughter while having sex with her husband. This private scene, taking place in the early hours of the morning, encapsulates the role she plays in her relationship with her family, the selflessness of her character, and the joy she derives from being a loving wife and devoted mother. These are skills that Sonichka has gleaned from reading the great works of Russian literature. So Sonichka makes a series of sacrifices as a wife, a mother, and a friend in her approach to these respective relationships that respond to their individual characters and behaviors with thoughtful selflessness and unconditioned care. This pattern begins when Robert asks her to marry him, and she leaves behind her career as a librarian and her aspirations as a reader. As she settles into her new life with Robert, books and reading almost immediately take a backseat to the importance of her new family. Sonichka's talent for the vivid and lively perception of life in fiction become clouded, somehow stiffened, and suddenly the most insignificant event on her side of the page became more important and more significant than the first love or the death of some fictional character, more important even than their descent into Hades itself. That extreme literary point where the literary tastes of the couple converged entirely. The principal sentiment expressed here is that Sonichka is not angered or frustrated that she has lost the time she once had to read, nor does she complain about having to give up her career to marry her husband. The reality of her situation is that her priorities have changed from those of a single woman to those of a wife and mother whose greatest love and passion, whose greatest love and passion has shifted from reading to focusing on the happiness and well-being of her family. This is not a jarring shift for Sonichka. On the contrary, it's a natural evolution, and one for which she is glad. She marvels at the little girl growing inside her womb and at the mind and intelligence of her husband, who daily teaches her new facts about the world, and she comes to feel as though the facets her life now consists of are far more significant and exciting than anything she could read in the pages of a book. She makes these sacrifices willingly and cheerfully because she loves her husband and the life that they have built together. So as her husband's career begins to flourish once more and her daughter starts to mature, they each clearly have so much to thank their wife for. Before he marries Sonichka, Robert's once illustrious artistic career is delayed when he's thrown in a Soviet labor camp. And then when he's released and finds Sonichka, she sustains him by providing for their family and caring for their daughter as he rebuilds his career to its former glory. As for her daughter Tanya, Sonishka works tirelessly not only to feed her, but also to provide her with everything a little girl could wish for growing up. But much of what Sonishka does for Robert and Tanya goes underappreciated, unnoticed, or at times even abused. Eventually, Sonishka realizes this, and yet she still perseveres out of love. Even though these sacrifices are beautiful acts in and of themselves, the true wonder of her character is displayed in her response to the thanks she receives from them. Thanks. Sonishka's reward for her selfless sacrifices vis-a-vis her husband and daughter is a cheating, unfaithful husband who starts an affair with a young schoolgirl, Yasya, who she takes in off the streets, might I add, and a daughter who squanders her education by sleeping around with the boys in her class at school and ungratefully benefiting from the material objects and unrelenting care that her mother provides for her in her youth. The reason that Sonishka can love her husband and daughter, and even Yasya, in the face of their thanklessness and abuse comes down to her generational personal connection to literature as a Jewish woman coming of age in the early 20th century. Russian literature has had a significant effect on her heart, her soul, and her mind that the reader witnesses as it plays out in her actions and reactions to the abuses of her selflessness and giving character by her family members. Part of the lesson embedded in Sonishka's character is that Ulitskaya has used her to embody the power and influence that a book can wield in shaping a human being for the better. To wit, literature makes the human being better at being human by exposing them to close examinations of various universal human conditions. Choosing to interact with the work of literature can mean anything from falling deeply and dangerously in love to staring death directly in the face. Because Sonishka has spent the first 27 years of her life reading literature, a time that encompasses some of the most impressionable biological and emotional states of human development, she has become not only a master of the literature, but also a master at understanding what it means to be human, what it means to love someone in any shape that may take, what it means to lose someone before their time, and to truly empathize with those around her. By the age of 27, when she sets aside the literature, she has already ridden into battle with General Kutuzov and Andrei Balkansky, killed a woman with Raskolnikov, and died with Ivan Ilyich, and lived to tell the tale. This is why Sonishka is able to walk through life loving and sacrificing for her family and accepting that she will never get any thanks or recognition for it, because the literature has taught her how to interpret, understand, and respond to the respective human natures of her family members, and imbued her with the emotional intelligence that lies at the base of her selflessness and love. During her marriage, Sonishka never once picks up a book for her own personal pleasure, but her love for reading and impact that Russian literature has had on her do not die. They lie dormant within her while she's caring for her family. But at the end of the povest, when she's buried her husband and her daughter has moved out of the house, she finds herself alone once again. But she does not despair. Instead, she picks up a book and starts to read.
And Alexander is our next presenter.
Is that it? No.
Oh,
I think it's.
oh, maybe it's here.
There it is.
Is that it?
Slideshow.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. My name is Alexander Peshatkin. I'm a junior student at NYU Shanghai, majoring in humanities and minoring in Russian and Slavic studies and China global studies. Today, I'm very excited to present my project, Reading the War in Ukraine in Migratory Russian Poetry, which explores how contemporary Russian poets Dmitry Bykov and Vera Poloskova have reflected on the war in their writings. Before I delve into my presentation, I want to express my gratitude to the Department of Russian and Eastern European Studies, and in particular to Dr. Molopini, for being able to present my research here at UPenn. I also extend my thanks to the NYU Shanghai Dean's Research Fund and Professor Arif Kamoglu for their research, for their support and guidance throughout this project. How does it work here? Let me outline the timeline of my presentation. I will begin with an overview of my project, followed by detailed discussions of the fifth migratory wave phenomena, and then we'll discuss poetry by Bykov and Poloskova. During the summer of 2023, I undertook a research project culminating in a 35-page paper titled Reading the War in Ukraine in Transnational Russian Poetry. Within this study, I delved into the realms of migratory Russian poetry and Z poetry, placing these distinct forms in critical opposition to one another. My objective was not to uncover political truth, given the evident polarization in Z poetry and emigre poetry, but rather to identify and delineate the diverse poetic voices contributing to the discourse surrounding the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. This analysis aimed to distinguish and amplify the nuanced perspective within these poetic expressions. I will now present my project focusing on migratory part and share some examples to illustrate my point. If it's acceptable to everyone, I would like to read one short example. It's in its original language, which is Russian, present translations on the slides for clarity. So Russian migration in the 20th and 21st centuries is a topic of significant interest among literary scholars. The works of prominent authors such as Nabokov, Bunin, Brodsky, Akunin, and others who left Russia and the USSR due to political persecutions formed the core of what is known as the literature of Russian diaspora, or литература русского зарубежья. While many of these writers achieved international recognition, winning Nobel Prizes and other prestigious literary awards, there were also authors who remained in the Soviet Union and continued to write. As a result, two distinct types of literature emerged in the Russian language, one from inside the Soviet Union and one from outside. The contrast between the contents of these literatures was significant, with authors like Alexander Solzhenitsyn speaking out against government repression and raising awareness of the Gulag system, while writers like Alexander Fadeev focused on themes of Komsomol, solidarity, and brotherhood. Sometimes one perspective was ignored, while another was favored, and vice versa, a phenomenon further explored in the literature of Russian diaspora studies. The Russian migration process can be delineated into distinct stages or waves that mirror the underlying social and historical forces driving migration. The initial wave corresponds to the period surrounding the October Revolution in 1917 and the subsequent Russian Civil War of 1970s-1922. The second wave predominantly occurred during the upheavals of the World War II, spanning from 1941 to 1945, when many fled from the war-torn Soviet territories. The third wave characterizes the post-Stalin era in the USSR during the 1950s, continuing until the late 1980s before the era of perestroika. The fourth wave unfolded in the 1990s following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, marked by economic turmoil and widespread poverty in the region. The fifth wave, exemplified by figures like Bykov and Polaskova, remains a subject of an ongoing study among sociologists. I contend that this wave emerged from post-2012 protests at Bolotne and gained momentum after the annexation of Crimea in 2014. According to World Bank data, the invasion of Ukraine in 2022 precipitated a significant surge in immigration, with over 1 million individuals leaving Russia to escape the insurance strife. This conflict marked the new phase of the fifth age. The climate of censorship it generated to not only news content, but also art, including poetry, has a longer history. In 2012, the Russian state parliament passed a law that allowed the Ministry of Justice to label Russian citizens as foreign agents. Multiple international structures, including the Council of Europe and the US Embassy in Russia, have pointed out that the Russian Foreign Agency law restricts human rights in the region. The law doesn't currently send agents to prison or deprive them of financial goods. However, it does bring certain restrictions for the individuals. Foreign agents are prohibited from carrying out educational activities related to minors in state and municipal educational organization, producing informational content for minors, and etc., etc. While these limitations changed over time, in 2022, the state definition of foreign agent dramatically expanded, with the state parliament accepting extensive revisions to the law that resulted in much wider groups of people being labeled as agents. It became a weekly occurrence for Russian oppositional figures to be added to the list of foreign agents. The most visible change for foreign agents was, of course, on social media, where they were required to post everything with the label of produced by a foreign agent. Likewise, anyone who publicly mentions a foreign agent must announce that they are being recognized as such. One of the authors analyzed in this paper, Dmitry Bykov, received this status in August 2022. Soon after the start of the war in Ukraine, Vladimir Putin signed another law compelling foreign agent and other who opposed the war to leave the country. On March 4th, 2022, the president signed a law against Russian military actions. This law aims to penalize public actions deemed to discredit the utilization of Russian armed forces, quote unquote, to protect the interest of the Russian Federation and its citizens and uphold international peace and security, end of quote. In reality, individuals can be charged under this law for describing the invasion of Ukraine as invasion or war, leading to imprisonment for social media posts or public statements against the government's rhetoric. This crackdown prompted popular politicians like Ilya Yashin and Vladimir Kara-Murza to face legal repercussions, causing many writers to leave the country to pursue their craft without censorship. Drawing from this political context, one can readily envision these constraints placed on migratory poetry, not only in terms of its connection to Russia and the Russian agenda, but also in very practical matters. While that poetry, which I also analyze in my project, is extensively studied in Russia, migratory poetry often receives less attention. This issue of audience is also pivotal. Why should we explore works produced for a relatively small number of migrants by those who have migrated? However, there are noteworthy exceptions exist. For example, in 2022, St. Petersburg publisher Ivan Limbach Press released the anthology Doomsday Poetry Chronicles, featuring poems written within 5 months of the onset of the Ukraine war by authors who opposed the conflict and subsequently left Russia for good. Despite criticism from state media, this anthology achieved significant success during this conflict. It's worth noting that Yuri Levin, a Princeton professor in the SLavic department who compiled this anthology, has also organized the conference Russian Poetry in a Time of War in 2023. So the rest of my discussion focuses on works from this anthology by notable figures like Vera Polaskova and Dmitry Bykov. So Vera Polaskova is a renewed Russian poet, journalist, and a singer who became a symbol of diasporic Russian literature after leaving Russia in March 2022. She gained prominence for her vocal opposition to Putin's aggression in Ukraine, supporting Ukraine's cause and donating to the Ukrainian military forces. Polaskova's career spans journalism, theater, and contemporary music, embodying a distinctive voice in the diasporic Russian literary circles amidst geopolitical tensions. Her work gained increased attention following a well-known interview with the Russian journalist Yuri Dud. Polaskova's poetic language in this poignant verse is characterized by a sense of melancholy that permeates the narrative of many of her poems. Let us look at the example of this. Let me read the poem for you. Как вы, Оля, как будто бы мы все умерли, только нас из тела не отпустили. Мы сидим растерянными мумиями на веранде в приморском стиле и глядим вокруг, вычисляя радус поражения, если грянет неподалеку. Вспоминаем, чему мы радовались, пока все не поблекло, пока все, обугливаясь, не выцвело до фотоархива из-под завала, пока сердце не дернулось прочь от выстрела, проводов не пообрывало, не упало расколотое 300-е в феврале, а дело-то уже к маю. Как вы, Оля? Как-то держусь, работаю, обнимаю. So this poem diverges from the earlier discussed in my work, that poetry, by adopting a free verse and a concrete narrative. In this piece, Polaskova presents a poignant storyline where a woman writes to her friend, Oля, expressing her emotions about the invasion in Ukraine. This departure from conventional word glorification in that poetry is striking as Polaskova crafts an emotional manifesto instead of political one, linking herself to lost mummies on the veranda in the seaside style, symbolizing hollowness within her soul post-invasion, where bodies are frozen in fear. The poem resonates with melancholy, emphasized by the protagonist's repetition of until, yearning for a time before the war ravaged their lives. Polaskova's depiction of recalling past happiness juxtaposed with the horrors of the war underscores her emotional turmoil. The imagery of Ukraine described as one half of my heart in her interview to Dutch signified not only fragility of protagonist's life, but also the plight of Ukraine itself, your need for safety from aggression. The poem concludes with Oliver's point, although, however, it's kind of dual. We can read it in different ways. But we can read it as Oliver's response, somehow holding on, working, hugs, reflecting mixed emotions and amid conflict. This dialogue can be interpreted as a conversation between a Russian migrant Polaskova and the Ukrainian Oля, where Polaskova grapples with the guilt over her country's action, while Oля, a friend, navigates complex feelings. The exploration of guilt is a recurring theme in migratory poetry, absent again in that poetry due to a different ideological perspective. Polaskova's shift to free verse and emotive storyline underscores her desire to convey personal anguish and empathy amidst the harsh realities of war. The second author, Dmitry Bykov, is arguably the most renewed among authors exploring war in their works. Bykov's extensive career spans journalism across varied media platforms, including the independent TV channel Rain TV, телеканал Дождь. His 100 lectures project on migratory literature features what he considers the finest writings representing each year of the 20th century, including works by notable migrants like Merezhkovsky or Bunin. Bykov's literary contributions are very diverse. He is a prolific writer of novels and poems, although not always universally acclaimed by the public and critics. Additionally, Bykov is recognized as a distinguished literary scholar and biographer with notable works on Gorky, Mayakovsky, Okudjava, and Pasternak. His roles as an educator in various academic settings, including lectures at Princeton and Cambridge, underscore his commitment to literary education and discourse. As some of you may know, Bykov currently resides at Cornell University, further extending his reach and impact in the literary world. In my analysis of his work, I'm closely examining his poems Zmyny Island. This particular poem stands out among the others I have analyzed due to its highly political nature, as it clearly identified sides and directly blames the Russian military forces. Let me go to conclusions. So, all in all, the exploration of diasporic Russian literature amidst the backdrop of geopolitical tensions revealed the impact of individuals like Vera Polaskova and Dmitry Bykov. Vera Polaskova's symbolic departure from Russia and vocal stance against Putin's aggression in Ukraine epitomized the role of literature in reflecting and shaping societal values during turbulent times. Her poetic language, exemplified by verses and melancholy and longing, captures the emotional toll of conflict on personal and collective identity. Through the metaphor of heart and imagined dialogues, Polaskova navigates complex theme of migration, guilt, empathy, resonating universally with themes of human suffering and resilience. In contrast, Dmitry Bykov's literary contribution, encompassing novels, poems, and scholarly works, demonstrate a nuanced engagement with war and politics. His poem Zmyny Island stands out for its direct condemnation of Russian military actions, echoing Victor Hugo calls to resist oppression. Bykov's diverse career spanning journalism, academia, and creative writing underscores the role of literature in challenging power structures. Together, Polaskova and Bykov exemplify the enduring relevance of diasporic Russian literature in confronting societal upheavals and advocating for justice and empathy across borders. Their works serve as a poignant reminders of literature's capacity to illuminate the human condition amidst the complexities of war and migration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I would ask you guys to come back here and sit at the table, and we'll move the microphone over, right? And please, when you answer questions, repeat in the succinctly. question of the individual. Okay, and yes, please go ahead.
For Catherine, it seems like Sonishka is like the ideal model for a Soviet woman, and Soviet citizen. And I'm curious if you think that she illustrates how an ideal Soviet citizen should have a love for literature, and in particular, Russian literature.
I think she's meant to be a little bit contrarian. I don't think she's I don't think she's meant to be an ideal in the sense of her love for literature. I think she's meant to, like, she's very dedicated to her family, and she's a hard worker, and that's kind of how she fits into the Soviet narrative. But I don't think Lubitskaya is trying to set up this, like, this is the ideal Soviet woman. I don't think that's what's happening. Yeah.
So a follow-up question for your paper, Catherine. Like, it's been a while since I read Sonishka, but from what I remember, as you pointed out in your project as well, that there's this early period of her life where she's a dedicated reader.
Yeah.
And she works at the library. And then suddenly this reading leaves
Yeah.
for a long time. And then she picks up reading suddenly at the end,
Mhm.
and it ends in this picking up the book. My question then is, if following this thesis that you drew is that reading for her early stage of this reading was sort of a reflective image for her to learn how to go throughout the rest of her life, why must she stop reading? Like, why is there such a sudden shift of suddenly no more reading in
Yeah.
the face of motherhood and familyhood? Why does motherhood and wifehood have to replace her identity as a reader? And what does this replacement tell us about her character and those maybe that are modeled after her that took after the Christian reader?
Yeah. I think it's just she's completely.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, yes. Sorry. The question is, if I can rephrase this properly, how, why does reading fall off for Sonishka, and why does this have to happen, and why does motherhood and being a wife replace this?
Sort of, it replace each other.
Yes.
If the motherhood replaces the reading, why can't they exist simultaneously?
So yeah, so why can't reading and being a mother exist simultaneously?
They're so important for learning.
Yeah. So there was a bit in my paper where I discussed her, like, fascination with her new life a little bit, and she's completely, she's kind of just locked into her new life with with her husband, and she really, really loves them, and she's dedicated. Also, he's, like, not really, I don't know if you remember, he's not really, like, making a lot of money, so she's supporting them as a seamstress. And all of her time is consumed by them. And like I said, it's not something that she's upset about, but it becomes it just takes priority over her reading, and she doesn't. There is a bit where she tries to get her daughter Tanya to love reading as well, and she's kind of trying to read to her there and get her to love books, but it doesn't really take. And so I didn't get a chance to talk about that because it would have taken too much time. But yeah, I just think it's not a priority for her anymore. And I think that's supported by the fact that as soon as her husband and daughter are out of the picture, she starts reading again, because all of a sudden she has this, she can return to her previous love. So yeah, I think that would be my answer, if that answers your question.
Thank you, the presenters, for the wonderful talks. I have a question for Jack. I was wondering if you thought or found any evidence. So there's this, which we talked about, mostly concerns the Moscow plane of the novel, like this kind of transient nature, value of money, paper. Is there any kind of reflection, any version of that in the Jerusalem plane? Is there anything that happens there that also exposes the kind of unreliability or material value, or is it just fully confined to what happens in Moscow?
Yeah, I think that if you kind of so I think that if we're looking
Oh, wait, repeat the question.
Yeah, okay. So the question is kind of regarding if there was kind of a focus in the Jerusalem narrative on money and greed as well as in Moscow. And I think there was when you look at kind of Judas. I was reading one historian was kind of noting that Judas also fell victim to greed and sometimes like personal motives when he turned in Jesus. And so I think that you can draw a parallel between some of the values of the people that turned on Jesus in those final moments for personal motives. I think there is mention in Master and Margarita of like trying to blame it on money and someone stealing money. And so I think that there is definitely a parallel in the Jerusalem scene as well as in Moscow.
Question on poetry. I understand in your example that Bykov and Polaskova start explicitly writing about war in Ukraine. What I wanted to ask is, do you notice any change in their language, on the formal element of their poem before and after the war? How does the war deform and change the poetry itself other than the content?
Yeah, sure. So the question was about whether or not I kind of notice differences between Polaskova and Bykov before the war, during the war, and like right now. So I think I'm not an expert in Bykov. I'm and Polaskova, like I'm not a scholar on them 100%, but I definitely can see the change in their language. What is happening in Polaskova is often kind of the idea that she needs to explain herself, that she's a Russian, but she's against the war, and it is kind of recurring in many of her pieces. In terms of Bykov takes, he's also a politician. He takes a very direct approach. He says, "You guys just, you messed up. We lost the country, and we have to talk about it now." So definitely, we see that the language becomes more direct for Bykov. Yeah, I hope I answered this.
Question for Catherine. I mean, this sort of derives from all three of the talks because all three of you refer to literature in various ways as something that exerts a force on the world, either directly or indirectly through the case of individual readers. But the Ulitskaya case raises this question in my mind, and that is, if you're arguing that classical Russian literature and its elements and stories and characters and whatnot have this transformative quality for Sonyashka in defining her character, can you offer any comment on what you think the force of Ulitskaya's own Vorist is in Ulitskaya's?
Well, oh, sorry. The question is, what is the impact of Ulitskaya's Povest on the reader, given the nature of literature's this force that it can exert on the reader? Did I get that correct? Okay, lovely. So Sonechka she's such a beautiful character, and she literally does not think about herself for the entire until her husband and her daughter are out of the picture. So I think she sets a beautiful example. I don't know if it's entirely healthy example, but she sets this beautiful example of selflessness and love that kind of makes you want to go out and do that too. And it can provide a lens or a structure, maybe a form for how to approach others. I mean, I couldn't really convey this properly in my paper, but she knows her husband and her daughter very, very well, and she can kind of interpret them and respond to them accordingly. So I think the impact is that it can influence how we as the reader approach the actual relationships that exist in our life. Maybe that's like too sentimental, but I think that's it.
Maybe I have questions for each of you, beginning with Jack. So the question about the denomination. You showed Chervonets, the picture that the slide, it was 1 ruble, right? But in that exchange with the taxi driver, there was mention of change of 4 rubles. So how did it happen that it eventually became 10 rubles, right? The denomination of Chervonets. So do you know the story behind it? How did it, like what happened? What sort of inflection?
How the exchange rate was established?
Yeah, because originally the denomination was 1 ruble, but then is it possible, maybe I'm misreading, but how is it possible that the change received from that Chervonets was 4 rubles? And can you, yeah, let's go ahead.
Yeah, so from what I understand, the exchange rate seemed to really fluctuate and never seemed to be established. But I believe in the context of the story, the taxi driver, because the person only had, those were the only rubles that maybe he had, I believe that he's willing to accept it just because anything will be better than this new currency that has been turning into these worthless objects kind of throughout. And so I believe that he's able to accept kind of anything that's a ruble and a non-Chervonets note.
Thank you very much. Actually, yeah, and I had other questions for Catherine, for you. Since Russian literature is like had that transformative impact on the protagonist, how would her story, how could be the context of Natasha Rostova and her story in Tolstoy, how would be projected onto her story and that dramatic change that happened to her? Could you comment on that?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
I can. Okay. The question is, what is the impact and like the projection of Natasha Rostova's character onto Sonechka and her story? The context that Natasha has brought, in which she's brought in, is Sonechka's sister has. There's a significant age gap, and she's. I believe Sonechka at this time is still like in her early teenage years. But her sister is married and has a daughter, and the daughter was playing outside and fell into a well and died. And Sonechka, it's like her first like experience with death, and she's like, this is a lot. And she uses Natasha Rostova and the time that she's caring for Andrei, and then eventually Andrei dies, and Natasha's response as a way to kind of understand what happens to her sister and to kind of empathize with her sister, but also to make sense of this death that has happened before. I mean, the child also dies. I think I mentioned this before her time, as Andrei's like late 30s, early 40s when he dies, so too early. So I think that is how, there's really no other reference to Natasha except for that. But I just used that as a way to support my claim that she is using the literature to understand and make sense of her own life. And that's mapping onto her relationship, mainly with her own family.
Thank you very much. And my third question is about readership, the audience of these two poets. And now they both left Russia, as far as I understand. And are they still influential? Are they still well known? And who is reading them over there? And how well are they known here? Who's their audience here?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really good question. So the question was about audiences. So Polaskova and Bykov, are they read here or like are they read in Russia? So the question is really complicated because, of course, talking about poetry about war by Russian authors is kind of restricted in Russia right now. But as I said in the intro, like the reason of me choosing Polaskova and Bykov and these two particular poems was because they were published in Russia openly by St. Petersburg publisher Ivan Limboch Press House. So that was kind of a big success for the Russian migratory literature, and of course this happened because of Yuri Levin, a professor at Princeton, and then this anthology was criticized a lot. But yeah, the question of audience is really important because is it really people who read these poems? Are they just the ones who migrated, or are these people in Russia? We really don't know. It's just 2024. Yeah.
Thank you very much, and I would like to thank the presenters. I think we have to stop now, right? Yeah, thank you very much.
It is my pleasure to introduce our next presenters, Tova Tashao and Liam Phillips. Please welcome. So I just want to remind the presenters you have 15 minutes for your presentation. Please be mindful of the time limit.
Please. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Tova Tashau, and today I'll be presenting a project entitled The Futurist Dynamism of Dimensionality, Embryos of Artistic Possibility in Velimir Chlebnikov. To start, Viktor Velimir Chlebnikov was a man of many talents. He was a self-trained ornithologist, avid geographer, and trained mathematician. He was also a poet, futurist, and playwright. But perhaps most indicative of his stature among the Russian avant-garde are his self-appointed titles as a zaumnik, or a transrationalist, an inventor/explorer, and even the king of time. Understandably then, Chlebnikov's oeuvre never lacks in stylistic complexity. It often verges on incomprehensibility and always showcases the eccentricity of its author. Indeed, Chlebnikov reinvented the art of poetry through his verse in an incredibly inventive and iconoclastic manner, even in comparison to his futurist contemporaries, who were known for their subversive aesthetic theories. In particular, Chlebnikov and Alexei Kruchoniks, a fellow futurist poet, created transrational language known as zaum, loosely translated as beyond sense. And in doing so, they revolutionized the fundamental form, content, and reception of poetry as such. In Chlebnikov's verse, zaum strives to become a universal language, which reaches back beyond the intellect to unearth primordial meaning in the roots of Slavic words. Via the creation of alogisms, or deliberately irrational creations, and neologisms, or novel word forms, Chlebnikov sought to transform zaum into the superrational language of the future, a language transcendental in design and universal in scope. Through an analysis of his unconventional path to the forefront of the Russian avant-garde, including an extensive education in mathematics and the natural sciences, I argue that Chlebnikov's verse presents a uniquely intuitive and deceptively logical attempt to reunify the world under a universal language, and in doing so, expand human consciousness to think transrationally and transhistorically. Through zaum, Chlebnikov sought to access a novel understanding of the universe and our place within it, a novel cosmological framework founded on a universal language and capable of accessing pre-rational thought. My analysis thus proceeds from a survey of Chlebnikov's upbringing, academic studies, and early involvement with the avant-garde. And then through an overview of his theoretical reflections on zaum, exemplified by an excerpt from his super saga, Zangiezi, I aim to reveal precisely how Chlebnikov's verse presents a novel cosmology and historiography through its innovation of zaum. While Chlebnikov's work resists broad characterizations at large, one common thread across his oeuvre is an appreciation of the natural world, inspired by his childhood in the rural Astrakhan province. Born in 1885, Chlebnikov was raised among the nomadic Kalmuk people, a tribe of Mongolian Buddhists. His father was a naturalist and an ornithologist whose enthusiasms inspired Chlebnikov's appreciation of the outdoors. The influence of the surrounding nature, in a both poetic and scientific sense, and the rich histories and mysticism of the surrounding tribal peoples would come to play a pivotal role in Chlebnikov's future creative ventures. Understandably, his interests grew to include ornithology, botany, geography, mathematics, mythology, linguistics, and the visual arts, all of which inform his work in unique and often intersecting ways. Chlebnikov's education included an uncompleted year of study in mathematics, a geographical expedition in the Urals, and another brief, also uncompleted year of study in the natural sciences in St. Petersburg. Once living in the European metropole in 1908, Chlebnikov quickly formed connections among prominent symbolists and became a periodic visitor to the literary gatherings at Ivanov's Tower. In 1910, Chlebnikov was introduced to Mikhail Matyushin, David Berliuk, and Vasily Kamensky, among other contemporary artists. As Kamensky, then the editor of the literary journal Vesna, reflected on his first impressions of the young poet in 1908, I smoothed out the notebook. On the first page, as if written with a hair, were some kind of almost invisible calculations. On the second page were random beginning lines of verse. On the third was written in large Slavic letters, sufferance and glances, but this was crossed out, and in a different handwriting was A Sinner's Seduction, which is a transrational piece he published in 1909. So perhaps no better metaphor epitomizes Chlebnikov's eccentric nature than a crumpled notebook covered in mathematical formulations and half in verse. The poet was indeed possessed in part by an unyielding drive for analytical precision, and in part by spiritual and creative whimsy, and his oeuvre is fittingly steeped in scientific jargon, rural mysticism and mythology, and linguistic complexity. In 1912, Khlebnikov co-signed the founding manifesto of Russian futurism, a slap in the face of public taste, situating him at the forefront of the avant-garde. This declaration established the radical nature of Russian futurism. The authors decried Pushkin and the Academy as, quote, less intelligible than hieroglyphics, end quote, and codified the poet's right to invoke word novelty, which included the transrational creations of Khlebnikov and Kruchonik, formally theorized in that year. We can thus see the importance of language and its mutability emerge early in Khlebnikov's career as a prominent ontological challenge. Khlebnikov saw his contemporary world as intensely divided and attributed the proliferation of global conflict to the immense diversity of languages. He juxtaposes the modern condition with the primitive state of humanity, where fewer linguistic divides persisted, and he suggests a correlation between the transhistorical rise in conflict and this diversity in language that impedes universal understanding. In this vein, Khlebnikov subscribed to the Aristotelian concept that words are an elusive veil, concealing self-sustaining ideas. The desire to uncover this universal lexicon of forms thus captivated Khlebnikov early in his artistic career and would remain prevalent across his theoretical maturation. So turning to his theoretical writings, Khlebnikov differentiates the tasks of verbal art and communication from its visual counterparts. In his treatise on poetry, he argues that, while painting has always been a language accessible to everyone, languages have betrayed their glorious beginnings, abandoned their past functions, and served the purposes of hostility. Khlebnikov's goal of crafting a unifying language thus initially followed the revolutionary path of the futurist artists. As he declared in his manifesto, The Word as Such, quote, we want the word boldly to follow painting, end quote. Language itself to Khlebnikov adopts a teleological framework in returning to its prehistorical, primordial, and universal existence. Khlebnikov's linguistic journey further began close to home with the goal to find, without breaking the circle of roots, the magic touchstone of all Slavic words, the magic that transforms one into another, and so freely to fuse all Slavic words together. However, Khlebnikov realized the potential limitations of confining his approach to the Slavic languages, and he reevaluated, aiming instead to, quote, find the unity of the world's languages in general, built from the units of the alphabet, or a path to universal beyond sense, end quote. Therefore, in essence, Zaum sought to reclaim a power for poetry that had been wrongfully obfuscated by the abstract metaphorical language of the previous generation of symbolists. As Khlebnikov claimed, symbolist writers, quote, have been looking into the human soul too much. However, they hardly knew that poets are the ones who create the soul, end quote. Zaum thus marks an active effort to restore poetry to its original power as life-sustaining and universal communication. In their initial experimentation with Zaum, Khlebnikov and Kruchonik began to emphasize the primacy of individual words over their semantic meaning. In The Word as Such, the two authors declare that a work of art is the art of the word, thus imbuing the individual word with an unprecedented significance. They reject any overtly emotional content, subtly critiquing their symbolist predecessors, claiming instead that the word worker remains face-to-face always and ultimately with the word itself alone. This empowerment of the individual word required an elevation of its constitutional, phonetic, etymological, and graphic characteristics, and Khlebnikov and Kruchonik just proceeded to derive meaning from individual word fragments and their constitutive morphemes and phonemes. An important comparison thus arises between the transrational poets and their contemporary Cubo-futurists. That just as the Cubo-futurists featured deconstructed and reconfigured objects in their paintings, the transrationalists also used word fragments and neologisms to optimize expressivity. Through this artful synthesis of linguistic subunits, they crafted novel words, reinvigorating language with a new dynamicity of meaning, just as Cubist painters attempted to present a dynamism of otherwise static forms. The true power of Zaum thus emerges from verbal rather than visual illogisms, whose inherent juxtapositions create newfound meaning that is not stable, but rather dynamic throughout time. Further, what appears as nonsensical from a rational perspective gains profound significance when contemplated from beyond the traditional cognitive apparatus. Therefore, the revolutionary capacity of Zaum emerges most apparently in its incomprehensible nature. As Khlebnikov quipped, quote, the magic in a word remains magic even if it is not understood, quote. By abandoning the aesthetic requirement of comprehensibility along with syntactical and grammatical rules, Chlebnikov rebels against the mediation of common sense and transgresses, rather, into a new dimension of beyond sense that abides by a new super-rational logic. Yet to truly establish a new linguistic methodology, Zaum requires the elevation of pure meaning over aesthetics with regards to languages, their constitutional words, and the individual phonetic units of such words. In his theoretical reflections, Chlebnikov thus prioritizes the inherent meaning of phrases over their aesthetic effects. Before us, language was required to be clear, pure, honest, melodious, pleasant. We rather think that language must first of all be language. And if it has to remind us of anything, then better the saw or the poisoned arrow of the savage. Zaum thus prioritizes the power of an individual word over its connotations, prosody, or even comprehensibility. Transrational poetry thus empowers a new subjectivity of its author, freeing creativity from the chains of common sense, codified language, and aesthetic laws. Chlebnikov further takes Zaum to its extreme in his attempts to escape earthly experience, uncover the hidden workings of the subconscious, and expand the human apparatus of consciousness itself. As he declares with regards to his 1912 transrational poem Turn-a-Turn, I wrote Turn-a-Turn in a state of pure irrationality. Only after I'd lived through on my own its lines, and had experienced for myself how they turned empty afterwards, did I realize what they were, reflected rays of the future cast by a subconscious eye upon the sky of the rational mind. This poem, consisting entirely of palindromes, presents the power of the carefully constructed transrational verse. Chlebnikov here claims to have discovered the rational structure of his subconscious mind through writing Zaum in a state of pure rationality. Beyond sense language becomes a medium by which the deepest, most incomprehensible areas of the psyche become intuitive. Turn-a-Turn thus marks the ultimate capacity of Zaum, namely the ability to trace a new framework of intuition from the primitive subconscious. To further elucidate the capacities of this transrational poetic language, I will reference an excerpt from Chlebnikov's super saga, Zangiezi. Chlebnikov writes the perspective of a beyond sense poet who can interpret the language of the birds, the language of the gods, and the language of the stars. Zangiezi, the super saga's narrator and interpreter of Zaum, declares, back, bog, move, mog, march, man muscle, I am maker and might, I am mover and may, I am matter and might, and so on. The repetition of the letter M evokes the letter's specific geometric meaning as detailed by Chlebnikov in his 1919 treatise To the Artists of the World, a written language for the planet Earth. In this piece, Chlebnikov catalogs the geometric significance of individual Slavic letters. And M, quote, means the disintegration of a certain quantity into infinitely small parts, end quote. The act of dissolution epitomized by this letter juxtaposes the construction of matter created by a maker, as in Zangiezi's verse. The super saga's narrator resolves this contradiction in asserting that, quote, now is the coming of M, mallet that mauls the great, omnivorous moth to mange the fur coats of centuries, end quote. Thus, Zangiezi's transrational verse creates a certain tension between the letter M's geometric meaning of deconstruction and the neologism's connotations of material creation. The M mallet becomes a tool that destroys, as the passage continues. Quote, the infantry army of M has ground down the rock of the impossible impassable, ground it into meal, into minute particles, end quote. However, the mallet also implies a dialectical process of material creation. As the passage continues, quote, towards M, the dugout of humanity sails, a proud breath filling the sails of government and states, end quote. The letter becomes a mallet, a tool capable of both destruction and construction, that in Zangiezi's verse comprises the words describing a genesis or an organic whole of sorts, maker, matter, man muscle, and moving. Chlebnikov uses Zaum here thus to create allogisms and neologisms whose meaning arises in their inherent juxtapositions. This dialectic of the word and the meaning it contains marks Chlebnikov's transgression into a novel dimension of transrationality, a suprageometric construction of sense in a realm beyond sense itself. In returning briefly to Chlebnikov's theory, one of the greatest capacities of Zaum arises in Chlebnikov's use of transrational verse to manipulate the continuity of time and experiment with its very construction. This transhistorical capacity of Zaum emerges as a conscious comprehension of the unconscious mind in all its previous development. Though subtle, Zaum yields intuition that can access a state of pre-rational consciousness. As Chlebnikov writes, Zaum's strange wisdom may be broken down into the truths contained in separate sounds. Sh, the, etc. We do not yet understand these sounds. We confess that honestly. But there's no doubt that these sound sequences constitute a series of universal truths passing before the pre-dawn of our soul. The individual sounds of Zaum, though not yet understood on the conscious plane of existence, surpass the rational capacities of the unconscious mind and access primordial meaning. Indeed, Khlebnikov finds that the human soul is split between the rational government of the intellect and the rich population of the feelings, much like his own intellectual training. To this end, he claims that poetry, quote, appeals over the head of the government straight to the population of feelings, a direct cry to the pre-dawn of the soul, end quote. Again, the pre-dawn of the soul. Thus, Zaum triumphs over the intellect by unleashing the primordial. But this is not to say that Zaum lacks any logical composition, however. In order to understand a piece of transrational writing, the reader must themselves engage in the requisite expansion of consciousness to grasp this beyond sense logic, which lies beyond the sensical or utilitarian logic of the unexpanded intellect. As Khlebnikov claims, quote, any desire to understand the sense and not the beyond sense of language destroys all artistic involvement in language, quote. Any universalization of Zaum thus implies a return to primordial form of consciousness, a communal consciousness of sorts. Zaum adopts the framework of a universal language capable of transcending the divisions fostered by this vast diversity in languages, and acts as a novel cosmology capable of raising human consciousness collectively to this kind of transhistorical awareness. Khlebnikov and his followers go as far to create a universal government in an attempt to realize this international linguistic unity. Quote, by right of preeminence and by assertion of our rights of seizure, we are the government of the planet Earth, end quote. The statement reveals the broader aspirations Khlebnikov held for Zaum and its ability to collectively raise communal consciousness to think transhistorically and transrationally under a new cosmological framework, a universal language for a universal people. Thank you.
Oh, could you help me? Okay. And how do you, where'd you put, make it presentation? Or, oh yeah, sorry. Which, get here. Mm-hmm. Okay, hello. My name is Liam Phillips. Today I'll be presenting a smaller section of a larger project. This presentation itself will be titled Form, Figure, and Sight, and Mikhail Kuzmin's Alexandrian Songs and Wings. We'll get started then. In Mikhail Kuzmin's essay on Beautiful Clarity, of Прекрасной ясности, 1909, Kuzmin distinguishes between two kinds of artists, those who bring chaos and division, расщепленность in the Russian, to art, and those who bring harmoniousness and fullness. This word stroynost appears in Kuzmin's novel Wings, Крылья, 1906, to describe the orderliness of a figure which, quote, was striking even beneath a jacket that captivated you and made you feel embarrassed. In his prose, poetry, and theory, Kuzmin uses stroynost to refer to, 1, the orderliness of literary form that brings one closer to beautiful clarity, and 2, the orderliness of a body, a figure, that is the homoerotic object of desire for Kuzmin's narrator or protagonist. In this presentation, taken from a larger project, I will focus on the recurrent figure of gray eyes under dark eyebrows that appears in Kuzmin's Alexandrian songs, Alexandreyski Piesny in 1905 to 1908, to explain how Vanya, the protagonist in Wings, achieves perception of his own figure in the novel and is able to perceive the stroynost of his own figure. In addition to Kuzmin's poetry, prose, theory, this project makes recourse to Plato's dialogue Phaedrus, more so than the namesake of the novel Wings, or inspiration for the namesake of the novel Wings. Phaedrus is a source of narrative and theoretical inspiration for Kuzmin throughout all of this work. Particularly the beloved lover relation in Socrates' speech, that manifests itself in the student-mentor relationship that forms between Vanya and Stroop in Wings. The capacity for sight is a central theme throughout Wings and Alexandrian songs, which, like many other themes throughout Kuzmin's texts, is inspired by Socrates' speech in Phaedrus. While knowledge of an object has the potential for finality, visual perception allows for the soul to glimpse images of divine beauty in an eternal and experiential process. For, quote, when he sees the beauty of earth, he is transported with the recollection of the true beauty. Vanya's use of sight is clear when he sees his reflection in a mirror in the Volga, when he sees another man's figure, Fyodor, in the bathhouse, when he scans Stroop's drawing room, and even in his moment of study with Shakespeare. Images of, quote, the Kazanskys, Stroop, and his apartment, and for some reason Fyodor in particular, as he had seen him last, как он видел его в последний раз, came to his mind until a torrent of beauty and life from the higher world came to him, like, quote, something long unseen, half forgotten. To reach the higher sphere and see celestial forms of beauty, Vanya recurrently perceives godlike forms on earth. Socrates says in his speech, for sight is the most piercing of our bodily senses, though not by that is wisdom seen. Her loveliness would have been transporting if there had been a visible image of her, and the other ideas, if they had visible counterparts, would be equally lovely. But this is the privilege of beauty, that being the loveliest, she is also the most palpable to sight. For Socrates, only beauty manifests itself in celestial and earthly forms that are visible. Knowledge or wisdom cannot be seen in the same way. Therefore, Stroop underlines to Vanya, when they first meet, that there are worlds of beauty for him not only to know which, but to love which. That is, worlds of beauty to see rather than to know or understand. The mechanism by which Vanya gains the capacity to see Strojnost in his own body comes from the stream of beauty which passes through the eyes. Socrates says in his speech, when the lover looks at the beloved, quote, the stream of beauty passing through the eyes, which are the windows of the soul, come back to the beautiful one, there arriving and quickening the passages of the wings, watering them and inclining them to grow. Socrates repeats in a different section, for as he reserved the effluence of beauty through the eyes, the wing moistens and he warms. Therefore, not only is the capacity for sight crucial to perceive earthly forms of beauty and glimpse true beauty in the other world, but the stream of beauty from one figure to another goes through the eyes. That is why in an episode in Wings, Vanya is quick to see Fyodor's, quote, furtive, gentle gray eyes and his own big gray eyes. Furthermore, when the beloved receives the stream of beauty from the lover through the eyes, he and the lover both have, quote, love's image, and his desire is the desire of the other, the weaker. He wants to see him, touch him, kiss him, embrace him, from Phaedrus. It is not by accident that the figure of the lover and beloved aligns with Stroop's description in the early pages of the original Strojny text in Wings, that is like, quote, a man of flesh and blood, laughing her sullen, who can be kissed, loved, hated. The figure of the lover and beloved, as well as the original text built with the laws of Strojnost, has the potential to be experienced fully and erotically to make one, quote, a perfectly modern man. This metaphor of text as body takes its clearest form when Vanya reads Shakespeare, and without understanding, the text embraces Vanya with hot arms as if it were a body. The act of seeing is a central theme for the beginning poems in Alexandrian songs. In the second poem, the narrator is inspired by Alexandria. Когда мне говорят Александрия, я вижу белые стены дома, небольшой сад с грядкой левкоев, бледное солнце особенно вечера и слышу звуки далеких флейт. The English, my translation is on the right. In this poem, to see is not a direct action of seeing objects in a phenomenal world. Rather, Kuzmin is told the word Alexandria, which triggers a flood of sensations and images, not unlike the sequence of images that come to Vanya and Stroop's study in Wings. Quote, tales of Egypt, Italy, India, these raptures over any acute country and any time, and these walks to the islands and so on. There's a transformation in this poem from one world to another, from one wherein Kuzmin is told Alexandria to the imagined world of Alexandria with all these sights and sensations. The verbs in the present imperfective form, to see and to hear, indicate a process of imagination that is happening currently for the narrator, and that this process is a routine and repeatable action. The repeated image of a man with gray eyes appears in this poem after a string of already familiar images. Когда мне говорят Александрия, я вижу бледно-багровый закат над зеленым морем, мохнатые мигающие звезды и светло-серые глаза под густыми бровями, которые я вижу и тогда, когда не говорят мне Alexandria. The image of this figure with light gray eyes under thick eyebrows is seen by the narrator when he hears Alexandria, but is even seen when he does not hear Alexandria. This image is of a different order. Alexandria has already been created as a dream place characterized by beautiful but general images and song, pale crimson sunsets, drunk seamen, stars above a calming city, and so on. Conversely, the image of bright gray eyes of this figure is related to the symbol of Alexandria, but not bound by it. It is the only image in the poem that is sustained in both worlds, the real world that the narrator hears, Alexandria, and the world that he imagines. The image of bright gray eyes is more concrete and descriptive. It eternally follows Kuzmin between Alexandria and reality. For the narrator, the image of this figure exists between concrete reality and eternal Alexandria as a bridge. In the framework of Socrates' speech, the image of a figure is a godlike form on earth that is most like the celestial forms of beauty in the higher world. By seeing this image, the narrator is already transported to another world, in this case, Alexandria, through the windows of the soul, the eyes. The exclusivity of this image to Kuzmin's narrator is most clear in the fourth poem of Love. The narrator sings, Люди видят садисы домами и море багровее от заката, люди видят чаек над морем и женщин на плоских крышах. The poem continues to list images not unlike those in the poem above, the general images of Alexandria that people see. The poem shifts drastically when the narrator sees something different than the crowd, the people. А я везде только и вижу бледноватые смуглые щеки, серые глаза под темными бровями и несравнимую стройность стана, так глаза любящих видят то, что видит великое мудрое сердце. In this poem, the image of a figure with gray eyes under dark eyebrows is contrasted with the general images that everyone else sees, or the people see. The narrator does not even see the images that he saw in the instruction. Everywhere, he only sees this figure. More so, the description of the figure is seen in greater detail. The narrator sees the incomparable stroyness of the figure, and this evolution and what the narrator sees closely maps onto Vanya's evolution of his own figure and wings. The second time the narrator of Alexandrian song sees this figure, he's able to distinguish the figure's stroyness, which he didn't see the first time. The final two lines of this poem can be understood in the context of Socrates' speech about the lover-beloved relation, and therefore Vanya and Stroop's relation. The eyes of those who are loved, that is, the eyes of the beloved, see what a wise heart tells them to see. By receiving the stream of beauty through the eyes of another figure, the narrator is able to see a subjective and private image of the figure as if it were in a mirror. Here, the narrator is the beloved who has gained the special ability of sight from the lover to see beautiful forms in their earthly manifestations. Throughout Wings, Vanya perceives other physical figures. This perception, acting as the stream of beauty moving through the eyes, allows Vanya to see his own figure in a new way. In the first few pages of the novel, Vanya, quote, turned from the window where he was standing and saw a very familiar, lanky figure in baggy clothing and coming through the door, Varion Dmitrievich Stroop. The appearance of Stroop's figure stirs within Vanya a curiosity of his own. In the next line, examining his reflection in the small mirror on the wall, he looked dispassionately at a somewhat insignificant round face with a high color, big gray eyes, a handsome but still childishly pouting mouth, and fair hair, which, not being cut short, was slightly curling. He neither liked nor disliked this tall and slender boy in a black smock with fine eyebrows. At Vanya's early stage, his figure is still misunderstood and looked at indifferently. There are glimpses of the familiar stroyness seen in other figures, but even these characteristics are not fully formed. An example, his face is handsome but still childishly pouting. Then the potentiality of the beautiful figure of stroyness is in Vanya's figure, but Vanya himself cannot see or completely understand the stroyness in front of him. In Socrates' framework, Vanya is both lover and beloved when he views himself through a mirror. Socrates' speech reads, and thus the beloved, having received the stream of beauty from his lover, loves, but he does not know what. He does not understand and cannot explain his own state. He appears to have caught the infection of blindness from another. The lover is his mirror in whom he is beholding himself, but he is not aware of this. Vanya, without knowing it, receives the stream of beauty from looking at Stroop's familiar and lanky figure. And with this beauty, Vanya is able to glimpse parts of beautiful Strojnost within himself, though only dimly. In his early development, Vanya does not have the clear vision to see his own figure Strojnost, and as Stroop says to Vanya soon after, you have within you the resources to become a genuine new man. Vanya sees his own figure more clearly in the end of part 2. One of Vanya's mentors, Daniil, understands the beloved relationship from Phaedrus that is still being constructed between Vanya and Stroop. Daniil tells Vanya, you're agitated, you're unwell, and I, like a kind doctor, like a mentor, am pointing out what you're missing, the life which for you is embodied by Stroop, and that's all. The text cuts to Vanya and Sasha swimming in the Volga naked. Sasha notices his formed figure. He says, how well formed you are, Vanyechka. He uses the word skladny here. Какой вы skladny, Vanyechka. Said Sasha, getting undressed and looking at the naked figure of Vanya. Vanya, quote, looked at the reflection, made to undulate by the spreading circles in the water, of his tall, supple body with his narrow hips and long, strojny legs, tanned by bathing in the sun, at his untrimmed fair curls above the slender neck, and at the big eyes in the round, leaner face, and with a silent smile, he entered the cold water. At this point in Vanya's journey, he describes his body in more detail than before. Looking in the reflection of the Volga, Vanya notices his now untrimmed fair curls, which used to be just, quote, slightly curling. His tall, supple body and narrow hips, and his big eyes from the round, leaner face, rather than a somewhat insignificant round face. And most importantly, Vanya notices his strojny legs that are now tanned from bathing in the sun. Vanya's figure has changed from the first time he perceives himself in the mirror. More so, Vanya's capacity to notice more about his body, particularly the strojnost of his body, marks a significant evolution in Vanya's own perception that has been formed through his interactions with books and bodies throughout the whole text. Through an examination of the perception of the body in Kuzmin's Alexandrian Songs and Wings, sight appears as first the ability to see physical things, figures, bodies, in a phenomenal world, and secondly, as a capacity of the soul to see the strojnost of a figure, its harmoniousness in form and construction, gained through the stream of beauty that passes through the eyes. The figure appears in both texts as an earthly but godlike form, and in Socrates' terms, that is a vehicle to celestial forms of beauty in a higher world.
Good, thank you. So now we have time for questions. So I ask those presenters to step up here. Okay. And please, when you're answering a question, briefly repeat the question, summarize for the people who are watching us online. So please, questions?
I guess I have questions. These are fascinating papers, and I haven't thought my question through, but I just wanted to, again, it's just both wonderful arguments, and I'm wondering so about your this paper, and I know that the other part of that project focuses on Malevich, right? And when you analyze trans-Russian language here, I mean, could you draw any connections with, it would be interesting if you already thought about connections between trans-Russian language and suprematism in general, but to narrow down my question to what would be a visual correspondence to that kind of zone? Would it be more like cubism or suprematism? And in particular, I'm thinking about those surfaces, right? So how, in some cases, you show the page and there was surface 1, surface 10, whatever. And how are they, how should we think them, imagine them, like suprematist floating things, or constructions more likely, or cubism, angular planes, facets. So I would be interested to listen to hear about that. And Liam, since you mentioned about the other part of that argument as well, could you expand on the connection between this interpretation of Stroinus and Phaedrus and rhetoric, and how does it apply to Phaedrus in particular? Well, it would be nice since it's a real comparison between Phaedrus and the wings. But since in Phaedrus, the madness is also plays an important part. Are there any elements of that signs of connections with madness in Alexandrian songs and the wings?
You start?
So yeah, I can start. The question was on comparing kind of Malevich's experimentation with suprematism and Khlebnikov's experimentation with Zaum, and if we can think of a visual counterpart to this kind of transrational language. Just based on comparing them, what struck me initially in kind of theorizing what I wanted to do with this project was that they both took these existing frameworks, Zaum was present. I mean, Khlebnikov wrote his first transrational poem in like 1909, Incantation by Laughter, well before like they formally theorized it. He formally theorized it with Guchenich, but they took these recognizable these forms of cubism, cubofuturism, and they developed them and expanded it. Khlebnikov did read symbolist poets. He was associated with symbolist poets, and he tried to publish poetry along their lines and was not very successful. And so what fascinated me was how they went beyond these traditional bounds and how they theorized something beyond that. And I think a commonality between their methods is that they both require this expansion of intuition, and they reject anything recognizable in the phenomenal world. They reject utilitarian reason, and they focus purely on things that are alogical, these alogisms. I think Malevich does so, which ironically he wasn't trained in geometry, but I think Malevich does so with much more geometric and mathematical precision. He defines the fifth dimension. He says, this is what I'm doing, and this is what it accomplishes. This is how you expand your intuition, and this is how you kind of can glimpse and glean what you're supposed to in a suprematist work. Khlebnikov, alternatively in Zaum, it's much more nebulous and kind of undefined. Like he says in those quotes, we're not entirely sure what these sounds mean. We just know that they hold this kind of primordial significance. So it's like the same kind of universal transhistorical meaning that Malevich sought to access, Khlebnikov is also seeking, but it's much less defined and it's much less rigid in its composition. It's honestly not very well defined at all. I mean, he says what his reflections on Turnitin kind of show us that. And the thought of trying to theorize a visual counterpart to Zaum is very, very interesting. I'm sure other people have written on this. I'm sure it's a very hot topic in scholarly debate, but I'm tempted to say some of the first Cubo-Futurist works that had these word fragments, like all of Malevich's pieces, that kind of reminds me, because it is very much so like putting alogisms on a canvas. I mean, that's what people described as like Febrilist works as alogical compositions with the juxtaposition, but still with recognizable things. They're just perverted. So maybe some kind of like Cubo-Futurist type work like that still has words in it, but it's not, I don't know. Or another possible answer is the supremist works that came after suprematism that have the same like suprematic forms, but like transparent in a sense. Yeah, but good question.
Okay, and I will repeat two separate but related questions. One about the rhetoric of Stroinus relating to maybe or other parts of this project. Well, here it's mostly the Stroinus of a figure that appears, The rhetoric of a Storonist, there's many ways to make this connection. One obvious being the second half of Phaedrus itself, where the text, the dialogue switches between Socrates and Phaedrus, between these long speeches about the soul and all these thousands of years and seeing celestial forms of beauty, to he asks Phaedrus, like, what makes a good speech, what makes a bad speech, and what distinguishes good from bad writing. Very similar to what Kuzmin tries to do in his On Beautiful Clarity. And conveniently for me and for Kuzmin as well, Socrates makes a pretty clear distinction to Phaedrus. He says, that the best speech should be formed like a body with all its various parts, and that it has this like sort of harmoniousness to it, where all the parts are conducive to the rest, and that the writer should be like a good butcher, where he cuts the parts, he should cut it cleanly on the arms and not within the middle. And they have this very long dialogue, which aligns with some of the same tendencies or ideas that Kuzmin has about Stroinist. And as far as madness is concerned in the Phaedrus and how this appears in Wings, one way to answer this question would to be this exclusive limited group of people. So one of the ways that there's many different kinds of madness in Phaedrus, but either at the fourth kind or the most important kind or whatever it may be is for Socrates, it's like these people that are looked at as outsiders, that see things in ways that other people don't. And one, even we saw it today in my presentation, such as the fourth poem in Love, in Alexandrian songs, all these people see these one images, but Kuzmin sees something else. And there's something to Kuzmin's narrator sees something else. There's something to the exclusivity of this image, as well as some sort of predetermined potentiality realized in certain people, that has to do with this special group of people that have these special powers to be able to take this to change in this way. That's why Stroop reminds Vanya plenty of times that you have within you the potential to become a perfectly modern man, but you have to do the right things, right? Also connected to that is, while I've pointed out here a few of the examples of seeing in both Wings and Alexandrian songs, there's also on the other side this idea of these people that are blind men and people that can't see. So one of the quotes just off the top of my head in the Helene's monologue of Stroop's, in his drawing room, he says, we see everything. We are the clairvoyants, the yasnovidinya, and there are other people who walk around like blind men and they can't see. So that's gives a little bit to that exclusivity of sort of these predetermined groups of people who have potential and who don't. I hope that's.
I want to talk about the end of your presentation. So there is this government of intellect and population of feelings, right? So this obviously recalls the long-standing duality both in Western metaphysics and political theory between mind and the body. Right from Hobbes and Spinoza, it is the body that is the multitude that is governed by the mind, that is the state, via the mediation of institutions, laws, and so on and so forth. The zone communicates directly with the population of feelings, and you end your presentation with saying that we are the government of the earth, right? So they supplant the government of the intellect. So what kind of a government? Is it this place, is state is the mind, multitude is the body? Is it this communal consciousness? If it's communal consciousness, then is consciousness conceptualized as a kind of unity of mind and body? What is going on there? And moreover, if there is this kind of ambition to speak directly to the population of feelings, what is the function of mediation? In this government of the earth. So there is lacking mediation, or what is it, right? Which is typical to have some kind of, again, institutions, laws as the mediation between the two of them.
You know, I don't even know how to rephrase that question. So I'm just going to answer it if that's okay. Okay. Or take a stab at it of sorts. As for what kind of government Khlebnikov is trying to establish here, I'm oddly reminded of this is totally anachronistic, but I'm oddly reminded of Tolstoy's What is Art and this like religious consciousness. And I think it's completely different, but in many ways it seeks to accomplish the same thing in art, in that it's this kind of universal understanding that's meant to what Khlebnikov wants it to do is kind of eradicate violence or get as close to that as possible. He very not very convincingly, but he does trace like the presence of contemporary violence to this kind of wide diversity of languages. And he thinks that if we can establish this universal language, this universal government, this like universal consciousness that ties back to some sort of prehistory that everyone shares, then there will be less violence. And in that vein, I think the consciousness kind of is tying into this unity of comprehension, unity of ease of communication between peoples. As for mediation, I'm not entirely sure. That's a very good question. Because obviously they're talking about establishing a government here, and this is at the end of their manifestos. There's a separate manifesto, I'm not sure exactly what it's titled, where they claim to establish a government independent of space and independent of time. So I'm not quite sure what kind of mediation they would even be appealing to in that sense, but it is this kind of like transhistorical, transrational government, not even a government in the terms that we would understand it, but a kind of communal consciousness of sorts.
Okay, I think we are.
Just one question.
Well, very quick.
Very quickly. I'm just so impressed with the topics that you chose to study. So I want to know who inspired you to study Kuzmin, to study Khlebnikov, because these are not the most typical, writers and poets, philosophers to study. And also, Tova, for you as a student of language, what came first, the image or the language? Because the language of Khlebnikov is so complicated, so it takes a lot of knowledge of linguistics. So what inspired you first, the language or his drawings? What was it?
Well, as for what inspired the study of Khlebnikov was his language. I was exposed to that freshman spring in Dr. Platt's famous masterpieces of 20th century Russian literature course. Famous in my life. And that's also where I was first exposed to Malevich. And I didn't really want to study any of this more in depth until I saw Malevich's works for myself in Paris. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll answer quickly about Kuzmin. How did I land here? I mean, the easy answer is that I read the novel in a class, Dr. Kim's graduate seminar, and so that I wrote a paper in that class about education and reading in the novel. So like throughout the novel, Vanya, the protagonist, reads all sorts of texts, and he has these weird experiences with them. And there's very interesting stuff there, just like that alone. But it always, after I wrote that paper, there seemed to be like something like he reads these texts in a weird way. Like when he reads Shakespeare, he doesn't actually even understand the English because it's in English, and he's sort of just saying the words to himself, like liturgical text, and they're just sort of like wrapping him in a warm embrace. So then I read a lot more sources, Phaedrus being one of them, Kuzmin's other stuff, and I started to figure out that there's like something more here than just plain education or reading. So, yeah, of course.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone.
We have
Uh,
a few minutes and I will introduce the
Oh, okay.
speaker. You can relax and take your breath. To the last panel of the SLavic Bazaar. Thank you for sticking it out all day. It's been a wonderful experience so far. Last panel, we're shifting to the new medium that has not yet been explored during the conference, namely film. And our two presenters are both from University of Pennsylvania. First, Sofia Amkaryan, and second, Zach McBride. Please.
So, hello everyone. My presentation today is titled Eisenstein the Collector, Eisenstein's Montage of Objects as Heir to the Cabinet de Curiosité. So, the literature on Eisenstein's theory and methods has long endeavored to think of his project as a demonstration of his particular passion for knickknacks, curiosities, and oddments, whether it be in his attention of close-ups, filming various set pieces and props, many from heterogeneous cultures in his movies, to his multimodal writing of notes involving newspaper scraps, sketches, and photographs. Eisenstein's approach seems to be one of profound eclecticism and anachronic jumping through historical periods and disciplines. This method was one that he especially strengthened in his last 2 years of his life, where one of his final series of essays consisted in a project of media archaeology, so to speak, where he aims at recreating and retracing the general history of cinema. Specifically, he constructs a vast genealogy of the forerunners of cinema, to which cinema could be considered the heir. And he finds these forerunners in the history of the arts, so in drawings, painting, sculpture, architecture, literature, theater, music, also in the history of practices of religious rituals, in the history of visual media, whether it be the camera obscura, magic lanterns, the microscope, the panorama, but also, most interestingly, in the history of displays and exhibitions and popular entertainment. The Kunstkammern and the Cabinet de Curiosité, the wax museums of Madame Tussaud, the world exhibitions, circus, and Grand Guignol shows. Eisenstein's idea as cinema as the heir of all artistic culture and as a synthesis of the arts fits straight into the Soviet context at which he is writing and aligns itself to some of the other slogans that were circulating in the public discourse at the time. Notably in a passage of the notes in which Eisenstein mentions his idea of the Soviet Union as a, quote, friendly cooperation, Содружество of nations, which becomes the basis for a friendly cooperation of the arts in the Soviet Union. And in another passage, we have his conceptualization of the synthesis of arts as a dialectical, quote, removal, снятие, of contradictions. Now, Antonio Somani describes two versions of the synthesis that Eisenstein formulates over the course of his life. In early Eisenstein and his preoccupation with montage, synthesis becomes the process through which a series of separate, distinct representations, изображения, are united into a general, meaningful, and emotionally powerful image, obraz. But in his later theories of method, synthesis takes a completely different meaning, that of tracing early phases of biological, psychological, or cultural history, and more specifically of noticing different paths of regression, пути регресса. In the chapters of method, and all of these paths, according to Eisenstein, we have a leading to some kind of synthetic, unified, and undifferentiated state. And he applies this approach of undifferentiated state to his genealogy of cinema. In one of these essays, The Heir, he mentions various forms of recurrence of the idea of synthesis, locating cinema within a genealogy that starts with the Greeks and continues with liturgies, Diderot, Wagner, Scriabin, and finally, we. A quote, we, that Eisenstein employs here in order to underline how his own cinema should be considered within the wider context of Soviet cinema. And the final stage for him of this genealogical line that we're discussing, the we, that ends the genealogy, that begun in the Greek tragedies, was for Eisenstein Soviet cinema as once more the, quote, art of the USSR par excellence, a form of mass art in which the social preconditions and the technical ones coincide, giving place to a new totality, social and aesthetic. Cinema, therefore, has a profoundly socialist medium in this genealogy. And in this genealogy that he creates, montage is presented as a process whose manifestations can be detected in different media and throughout the history of the arts long before the appearance of cinema, as I said before, even though such manifestations can only be recognized in the après coup, from the retrospective vantage point of a cinema, which acts as a, quote, magnifying glass through which the method of each of them is visible. Montage for him, then, is a way to realize the transhistorical urge to record cinema, and he explores the historical appearance of various forms of media that belong to this genealogy. And my paper is interested in this quality of airness of Eisenstein's own cinema as part of this ideology. Specifically, it aims to situate and explain his long demonstrated interest in anachronic objects and his overall eclecticism as an heir to the Cabinet de Curiosité, the Kunstkammern of the 17th and 18th century, the wax museum of Madame Tussaud. And in this way, I attempt to understand Eisenstein as a collector, even if his earlier works, where he had not yet formulated these principles of synthesis and sensuous thinking. In locating this collection, I look at the cinematic pattern of him filming objects up close, characterizing them as cinétoys, as he calls them, which he uses to produce a desired effect. The close-up must feel isolated and focus on the object itself, its movement, and its evolution. I look in his cinema for traces of the found object of the surrealist André Breton that Anne Nisbet borrows to characterize any objects that seems to fascinate Eisenstein for its unique characteristics, enough that he dedicates an entire frame just to them. I conceptualize this collection as offering then a cast of objects felt very strongly throughout his filmography, thinking of Eisenstein as his own Barnum or Madame Tussaud. And I argue that his cinema harbors the very history of recurrences that he notices in the genealogy of the art form. And I'm hoping through this paper to formulate 3 principles of this recurrence in his presenting of his collection of these objects. The first one is conceptualizing Eisenstein as an animator, a ventriloquist, a reviver of the inanimate. We see this in several of his early movies, for example, in Battleship Potemkin, where we have the stroller. We also see this in Potemkin with lions, and other examples include glasses that I'm not going to be discussing today. But what I mean by his reviving of the inanimate is that the object is an everyday life object that through montage seems to gain a life of its own. Notably in the sequence of the stroller, the montage cuts to this frame, then people running on the steps, and then again this frame, although without the face of the baby. And then the wheels, and then again, the people suffering, and then a horrified face of a person in the crowd, and again, the wheels. So we really have this wheel as the form, a vital form that manifests in the stroller. And same here in the sequence of the lion, the threefold sequence of the lion first sleeping, then realizing the situation, and then awakening at the opera house of Odessa before complete carnage also seems to imbue the lion with a life of his own. Now, we have this also in Old and New, of course, with the Eisenstein's framing of the milk separator, which is shot in many, many different angles. At first the top, then the round body, the shining body, and then its individual tubes, once again seeming to create a life of its own. Now, the second principle that I identify is looking at Eisenstein as an encyclopedian, as an anthropologist that traces natural change and progress. And specifically here, I want to look at 2 sequences. The first one is in October, at the very beginning, And throughout the movie, when the statue of the Emperor Alexander III is at first dismantled through montage, of first his arm falls, then the second arm falls, then his head topples down. But then later on in the movie, he reverses this sequence and the head comes back into place, as well as his hands. And I identify this as almost an encyclopedic tracing of Eisenstein of history and change, and in this case, the progress of the revolution. And we also have this deconstruction and reconstruction of parts in Old and New, specifically with the tractor, where quite late in the film, when the tractor is finally introduced into the village of Martha, we see a montagic reconstruction of the components of the tractor. First, the wheels appear, and then its top, and then its seats. And these two patterns, I see Eisenstein as tracing a process, a gradual process of change and evolution. And in the first case, revolutionary, and in the second case, technological. And finally, the third principle that I want to look at is conceptualizing Eisenstein as a Barnum, creating a spectacle of the real and the unreal. He often talks in these notes about the merging of fake constructions such as bones and then turning into real subjects of entertainment for the people, as well as the Grand Guignol theater, which uses marionettes to create horror. And in this vision of Eisenstein, in this principle, I see montage as helping Eisenstein explore a reality of petrification and looking at how the object itself imitates reality. And I have several examples of this. The first one being in Old and New, with this montage of the bacon factory, slicing the pigs, rolling them in a machine, and then putting them to glaze. And this sequence is intercut with this porcelain pig, which rotates from left to right, creating this intellectual montage that is characteristic of later Eisenstein. But still, we have this fascination for the petrified and the object as a mimicker of reality. And we have this as well in October, famously in the sequence where Eisenstein incorporates a series of deities from various traditions and cultures, while also comparing the imposter Bonaparte to the real statue, and then gradually ridiculizing the mere prospect of petrification and of statue making. And I identify this pattern once again as Eisenstein questioning the relationship between reality and its representation in the commodity form, and specifically in October as a way to remember history and remember a past that is no longer. And in conclusion, these three principles I see can help us conceptualize Eisenstein's own cinema in his own ideology. And by looking at him as a collector, we achieve a new understanding of his eclecticism of methods by looking at how his merging of different cultures and histories throughout time also happened way before he theorized about such a thin synthesis and such a reoccurrence, because, as one may argue, his cinema itself is symptomatic and is part of the genealogy that he traces. Thank you.
We're going to take the questions and answers after the second presentation, so come on up.
Hello, everybody. My name is Zach. I looked up a PowerPoint tutorial on YouTube before this, so I got to say, I might be a PowerPoint warrior now. You can be the judge of that. Hopefully it's flash and some substance as well. Okay. So my presentation is going to be the one and only Mimino as a portrait of an intermediary in the Soviet family of nationalities. Just as a little background on Mimino, it's a very popular 1977 comedy with by Georgian director Gregory Daniela. The protagonist Mimino is a Georgian bush pilot, and the film just follows his quest to fly commercial airliners. He goes to Moscow. There's bureaucratic hijinks. Hilarity ensues. Now, unlike some of my other favorite comedy films, like Adam Sandler, it actually has a very sophisticated story being told as well. And that story is the challenges and kind of the double standard of being a minority within the Soviet family of nationalities, and how people like Mimino, who are kind of moving in between the metropole of Russia, or the Soviet Union, and then the rural aspects of the Soviet Union, kind of have to sacrifice their ruralness and their culture. And Daniela explores that through a kind of a three-pronged approach. There's the plot, which talks about it, and then there's also the montage and the mise-en-scene, and all three aspects kind of work together to kind of tell this story of disconnect and being a stranger in both worlds. So there's the three lenses for analysis: plot, mise-en-scene, and montage. And we'll start with plot. We'll be doing a few close readings, but close viewings instead. The first interaction, so just to give a bit of context of this scene, Mimino comes back from kind of doing like a supply run for his village, and he also brings a movie back from the metropole, which shows a Orientalist. Sorry, I'm like stuttering so much. Oriental. Oh my. Thank you. Spasiba. So basically, it's this satirization or this characterization of like what Eastness is, and it kind of looks at how the Caucasus, which is the Soviet Union's own East, doesn't really understand what is going on, like how they perceive them. So we'll just look at this. So here's the film, and Mimino, he's translating it. Interestingly, both by language and by like what's going on. So they're going to ask questions, and he's going to have to explain what's going on. So they ask like, what's even going on? They have no idea. Because it's so strange. This like stereotyping is so far removed from what like actual day-to-day life is. Okay, and then he asks for the hand of his daughter in marriage, and then he gets rejected, and then he shoots himself, and then the film's over, and everyone's a bit confused by that. And I think, even though it is pretty funny, I think there is kind of a deeper meaning here, which is Mimino is introducing the prejudices of the metropole to the rural area. And even though this isn't specifically documenting Georgian culture or Armenian culture or Azerbaijani culture, it's showing that there is a caricature in the mind of the metropole that isn't really accurate, and the people being caricatured are so far removed from it that they don't really understand it. It's so foreign. And that's kind of like, that's introducing the metropole side of this difficulty that Mimino is going to encounter. And then another scene, just to give some background, is Mimino comes to Moscow. He's trying to get his permit basically to fly commercial aviation. And he gets into a physical altercation with another Georgian man who had a illegitimate child with his sister, and then left his sister to go to Moscow, kind of ran away. and Mimino tries to kill him. And because of that, he's arrested, and this is him meeting with his public defender, and they kind of just have a discussion. Oh my gosh. I'm an Icarus. I've flown too close to the sun with my PowerPointing skills.
Здравствуйте. Это мой адвокат? Меня назначили. Валентин Константинович, это мое первое дело, и вы имеете право отвести мою кандидатуру и просить более опытного адвоката. Ну что вы здесь? Садитесь. Ребята. Вы не волнуйтесь, спрашивайте. Спасибо. Валентин Константинович, была ли у вас раньше личная неприязнь к Папишвили?
So he's going to deny there was no animosity.
А за что вы его избили?
Я его не бил, он заперся.
А люстру вы разбили?
Люстру разбил.
Почему?
Потому что он мерзавец.
Значит, у вас была неприязнь к Папишвили.
Нет.
So he denies it again.
Валентин Константинович, поймите, сейчас ваши действия квалифицируются как злостное циничное хулиганство, 206 часть 2, и караются сроком лишения свободы от года до 6. Но если есть причина, факт личной неприязни, то дело рассматривалось бы как мелкое хулиганство, 206 часть 1, там от 6 месяцев до года. Вы понимаете, как это важно?
Okay, so it is funny, but I think there's a deeper thing going on, which is there is the Soviet legal system, and Mimino's personal obligation to his culture is running him into a brick wall within this interaction. So obviously, there's the cultural stigma of having the illegitimate child for his sister. He doesn't want to further embarrass her by bringing it up in a public forum, having it read onto the record. So there's the Georgianness. But then there's the Soviet metropole, and it's like, hey, this is just how we do things. It doesn't really matter. Work with us here, and you're going to get off easier. But he just refuses to give up this portion of himself, his culture. And I think it's part of a more systemic issue, which is there's this double standard within the family of nationalities between the metropole and like the rural cultures, which is he has to understand intimately what the culture is in the metropole, but the metropole doesn't have to understand his culture back. So this is his advocate, his public defender is doing really well. There is no explicit discrimination going on, but implicitly he's basically put into this position. You're going to have to give up your value system in order to be treated fairly within this criminal justice system. And that's, while it is like put up for laughs, it is a serious issue that's going on. Now, for the last one, Mimino, he's at the nadar of his, he's at the nadar of his personal voyage to the metropole. Because he was in jail, he went over the age limit to be retrained as a commercial pilot. So he's broke, he's out of cash. He goes to the airport to come home, like tail in between his legs. But then he meets a bigwig, a local bigwig who is in the Soviet military with who he thinks is Mimino's father. And they have this conversation. And then there's also the funny, famous line where keep the change when he tries to buy the tea. So now they're going to the bureaucratic center.
Иди. Я сейчас. Сядь здесь. Здравствуйте.
Едем. Куда?
Туда.
Товарищ. Леночка, 2 чая, пожалуйста.
Кто это? Волохов. Тот самый?
Да.
Попросите мне жандарей.
Was?
Познакомься. Здравствуйте. Здравствуйте. Проходите. Спасибо. Узнал бы? Похож. Я сразу. Смотрю, стоит чай пьет. Как толком ударило. Живой лосо. Живой. Только постарел. Коте. Что Коте? Отца Коте звали. Да нет. Твоего отца звали Лосо. Понимаешь, Василий. Константина. Сынок, ты не путай. Мы с твоим отцом 3 года, понимаешь, в одном танке. А ты мне сейчас рассказываешь. Он в пехоте был. Извините. Молодой человек.
Okay, so I think, basically, there's kind of 2 Nadars like in conversation with one another. There is the personal devastation that Mimino is feeling in the moment due to being rejected from flight school, and then there's also the low point of the Soviet Union, which was the German invasion, and they're kind of in conversation. Those two, the personal and the state low point, are in conversation. And what's interesting about this is kind of the positive depiction of the family of nationalities within the film. It doesn't matter that Mimino's father actually wasn't the person that the 2 older bureaucrats thought it was. In the end, it only mattered that Mimino's father joined the call to serve and joined the family of nationalities of the Soviet Union. They're working together. And it is kind of a very positive, endearing moment. By shedding blood together, collectively, they became one big family. So even though there were some negatives in the first 2 scenes, at the end, the director here is saying that there are positives to this. It can be a positive thing to be part of this family of nationalities. And then the last section is after he works with the bureaucrats, he's able to get his pilot's license. And for a few years, he is a commercial aviation pilot. But then when he's in a West German city, he goes to call his friend that he made when he was in Moscow. The friend was from Armenia, and he speaks with the phone company, and it actually patches him into Tel Aviv instead of the Georgian city, Tel Aviv. So here it's kind of a moment. And on the phone, he's speaking with this Georgian man, and they both kind of bemoan with each other that they've kind of given up this place that they love, Georgia. And it is a very heartfelt scene.
Добрый день. Do you speak English? Вы говорите по-английски? Да.
I want...
Я хочу...
Кавказ. Yes.
Soviet Union. Diligent.
Diligent. Diligent.
К сожалению, это невозможно. Спасибо.
Tel Aviv? Yes, sure. It's possible.
Да, это возможно. 1 минуту.
1 minute, it's not possible. I'm sorry.
1 минуту нельзя. 3 минуты.
And 3 minutes, 25 more.
3 минуты стоит 25 марок. Окей. Хорошо. Пожалуйста, запишите номер.
Thank you.
Спасибо. Пройдите в 6-ю кабину. Спасибо.
Mister? I'm sorry, there's
Мистер,
no answer.
простите, ваш номер не отвечает. Мгм. Это кто? Исаак. А где Анзор? Не знаю. Исаак, запиши телефон. 5520 записал? Скажи Кукушу, чтобы он по этому телефону позвонил в Дилижан и сказал Хачикяну, что Валико ему на международной аэролинии купил крокодила. Какому Кукушу? Это Продмах? Ты куда звонишь? Как куда? В Тель-Авив? Тебе перепутали. Это Тель-Авив. Тель-Авив. Анзор, это ты? Кончай дурака валять. Деньги идут, валюта. Правда, Израиль. Клянусь мамой. Израиль?
Yes, yes.
Алло. Всего хорошего. Подожди. Ты сам откуда? Из Тель-Авив. В Кутаиси давно был? Давно. Всего хорошего. Подожди. Новый мост там уже построили? Не знаю, наверное, построили. Подожди. Давай споем что-нибудь. Что споем? Вот это. Алло. Исаак. Почему ты замолчал? Я плачу. Не вешай.
So, for almost the entire runtime of the film, Mimino is running away from either his Georgian identity or his rural identity or a combination of both. But in a misguided view that for him to be successful within the Soviet Union, he has to outgrow his Georgianness. And once Mimino partially integrates into a metropolitan professional life, Daniela introduces a scene that for the first time unabashedly states, it is a good thing to be a Georgian. It is okay to be a Georgian. Perhaps more importantly, to keep in touch with your Georgianness than to become like the modern Soviet man. And the setting of the sequence is also symbolic. The phones have no connection to the Caucasus. There is no way for them to get to the Caucasus, much like Mimino and Isaac too. But Mimino, unlike Isaac, has the opportunity to go back, and through which he does end up going back to the Caucasus. And through this sequence, Daniela is adding a plank to the rules of the family of nationalities, the right to not need to be assimilated, or at least not so completely, into the Russian-Soviet metropolitan social and cultural life. For the Soviet family of nationalities to be successful, all cultures need to be able to continue. It doesn't need to merge together into one. Now, that was the plot analysis, and he goes back in his helicopter. It's a very nice ending scene. I kind of want to talk about the editing very quickly. Basically, running low on time. Basically, the interesting thing is every time that Mimino is in conversation with anyone except the Armenian man who accompanies him, it's all reverse cuts in the dialogue. Only the Armenian man and him are on the same wavelength culturally. And so when he's talking to his family, it's all reverse cuts to kind of like get that separation going. And then it's only after he has this epiphany that he wants to go back that there are no longer reverse cuts in dialogue. So the montage kind of adds that explicit divide. And then there are a lot of lingering shots as well. It just kind of symbolizes what he wants. There's a lot of time spent on looking at jetliners, and then there's sequences of him looking longingly at like rural spots in the Soviet Union. And then for the mise-en-scene, there's the spatial, then the color. The spatial is pretty interesting. Whenever Mimino is in the rural village, all of the modern-looking children are engulfed in like the large mountains, kind of just showing that there's kind of like this divide between the rural and the metropole. And then the same thing happens whenever Mimino is walking through the Soviet city. He's just this small guy in this huge shot of like Moscow. And then the color is pretty interesting. Whenever he is in his village, he actually wears clothing that is artificial dyes. And then everyone else in his family wears natural like clothing and natural dyes that you can get. So he's the modern one going into the village. But whenever he's in the metropole, whenever he's in Moscow, he always has a leather jacket on, which kind of is a natural like fiber. So that's his ruralness. So it's how he's perceived in both areas. In the metropole, he's perceived as like the rural Georgian. At home, he's perceived as the modern metropole man. So in conclusion, in closing, the Soviet Union was an experiment in how metropolitan Russians interacted with rural ethnic groups, and Mimino shows how this experience had developed almost 50 years into the growth of the family of nationalities. In a modern context of conflicts erupting across the former USSR, Mimino acts as a reminder that cross-cultural cooperation is possible, and by taking an honest look at the ups and downs of a Georgia man serving as a link between the Soviet metropole and rural Georgia, Daniela creates a time capsule of the hopes, annoyances, and realities of an era in which cross-cultural cooperation was commonplace. So yeah, thank you.
Perhaps we have time for a few questions.
Yeah.
So if you could take a seat at the front.
Do you move the microphone?
Yes.
And the second question is the type of montage that is used in these principles and whether also it differs from Eisenstein's periodization. To answer the first question, definitely they do develop through time. My argument is that there's these guiding principles that I identified, but they're still very much influenced by Eisenstein's theory of the moment. So in Potemkin and in Strike, it's still a preoccupation with a montage of attractions, a montage that is very picture thinking like, such as with the lion. But you also see the principle of, for example, attributing life to an inanimate form in a much later film that I didn't discuss, such as Que Viva Mexico, which I think is the culmination of this theorization of looking at history through objects, but that I'm hoping to also identify in these younger films. So definitely they do develop in each time. And again, we have at first the preoccupation with montage, and then a preoccupation with synthesis. And especially even in old and new, we already have Eisenstein's theory of transposition and of looking at synchronous times of history in the same movie. And to answer the second question, they definitely do rely on different montage. Strike would rely more. Strike and Potemkin. In Potemkin, we have, of course, the concept of pathos, which is really these emotional faces and graphic faces juxtaposed with violence. In Strike, I would say it's more a montage of attractions and of the technology in the film. And then in the later, in Eisenstein's later work, the montage, I think, is almost more experimental, more playful, I want to say, and his collecting really takes a new form where he's interested also in the representation of history in these objects and not just these objects as existing in everyday life. Thank you.
Mine is not really a question. It's just thank you for bringing me back to my mental plate. I think I'm gonna have to rewatch Danelia's work. That's a very interesting take you presented. Thank you for that.
I have a question about Mimino. Well, what is the place of irony and self-irony in your analysis? Since Danelia was Georgian himself, so how do you take his position?
Sorry, I'm kind of hard of hearing. I can.
Well, I'll take it again. So irony, since Danelia was Georgian himself, so is there a place for? Could we interpret any of these his perspective, let's say, the perspective of irony, self-irony, or just he identified with that Soviet universal nationality position, or does he remain Georgian? What is his play?
Can I piggyback on that? If you could also address his intended audience in your question as far as these dynamics are concerned, I'd be curious to hear.
Okay. So the two questions were, how does self-irony and Georgianness relate to the piece of art, and then also what the intended audience was for the film. I think what's interesting about I'll do the intended audience really quickly and then go to the self-irony. The intended audience is very interesting, as in it was for the entire Soviet Union, the metropolitan and the rural. It was built for both as a film. I think what's interesting about it is there is kind of like a double meaning in some of the shots that kind of goes like the irony later on. It is built so it would be commercially successful, or not commercially, but it would be successful for almost every type of people within the Soviet Union. But then there is also a discussion of how Georgianness can kind of seep through. And the self-irony, I think, is actually a very good point. That is a large portion of the work. The clips that I put into it wasn't focusing on that, but there are scenes like when Mimino and his Armenian friend are doing traditional dances at the hotel. That is kind of a self-irony kind of being depicted as goofs. Of course, whenever he talks on the phone, Mimino talks really loudly. It's almost like he doesn't know how to use a phone, which isn't the case. But there is a lot of self-irony within Georgianness, but then there's also a lot of irony in how the other Soviet people saw the Georgian people. Like, there is a scene where Mimino and his friend are trying to get into like an apartment to like jumpstart their car, and then like this Russian man shows up and gets horrified because he shouts something along the lines of like, "Oh my gosh, Caucasian bandits," and then runs away. And it's like, it's very obvious that they're not. So I think irony does play a very big part of the role, even though that wasn't the focus of my paper. It is very much part of the film. Sorry for the filibuster.
I believe we are out of time, or do we have time for one more question? I have very brief questions to both of you. So first, even though, okay, you show a certain deconstruction of Orientalism, irony, and so on. How do you interpret the scene when he calls Tel Aviv, but he asks to call Kafkas?
Yeah.
And not Armenia.
Yeah.
He wants to call Kafkas.
Sure.
The city, Tel Aviv.
No, but the first city he's calling is in Armenia.
Yeah.
The first,
because he's trying to,
So this is Kozak, and for Sophia, quick question. I'm interested in the concept of airness, to being an heir. Heir to what? It's very strange because it's heir to some kind of a trans-historical process. So it's not airness in linear kind of historical development. It's airness to being, if I understood you correctly, to this urge, which I assume is their urge to record the process, which is perpetually available, perpetually present throughout history. I just wonder what it does to the concept of being an heir to something, which is usually conceived as following.
Shall you go first?
Can you go first?
Oh, okay. Oh, we were both not trying to go first. No. So, can I just borrow? Thank you so much. How do I interpret Mimino first trying to call a city in Armenia and then trying to call a Georgian city and then being forced to? Am I getting that right? Yes. How I interpret that is he was trying to get directly to his friend, and then he is under the mindset, oh, if they don't have this town, which I'm familiar with, let me go to the next best thing, which was the city in Georgia, and then he doesn't even get there. So it's kind of just like a dual perspectives on the Caucasus and what Mimino would understand as like important in knowledge of the Caucasus, and how the outside world just doesn't have that knowledge. That's how I interpret it.
And as for the concept of airness, I think that the concept of airness is first of all developed at the very late stages of Eisenstein's life. He is very close to his death, and he is frantically trying to produce this genealogy of cinema and this history of the art form completely, as well as the history of Soviet cinema. And when he mentions the air, he calls what is the air is cinema. But my argument in looking Eisenstein cinema itself as the air of this cabinet de curiosité, of this practice of eclectically picking objects that seem interesting, that are curious, and then exhibiting them for a political purpose, but also for a purpose of entertainment, views this airness because once, like you said, you have the same urge to record a phenomenon. In Eisenstein's case, is the phenomenon of history, but he's also, of course, interested in looking at rites and traditions and the role of religion in everything. And something I didn't get to mention is his preoccupation with these objects is also with objects of a foreign nature and of these quote, primitive societies that he views exhibit thoughts that are very useful for Soviet cinema. But I think also it's in the mode of representation and in the mode of framing of these objects that he is an heir, because he exhibits this sort of, I guess, eclecticism, but also the visual curiosity of objects is very much present in all of these shots, and his close-ups to them is very museum-like. It's very with in October with the statue of the Tsar, we have then a close-up of the actual description of the plaque right under the chair. So we have this practice of not only showing and zooming like a mirror or like a magnifying glass onto these objects, but also of trying to understand their history and exhibiting their curiousness and asking what it can do for the author's specific purpose.
Okay, with that, we thank our presenters and we close the SLavic Bazaar.
say that whenever we have left, if you want to grab some things and napkins and take them back to your dorm or your home, we have all this food. So please don't let it go to